If you're a single parent of a teen boy who's slipping away mentally and emotionally, with screens swallowing him and social media making it worse, here's why what you're dealing with is not a phase and not attitude and not just how kids are now. It's something that has entered your home, sat down in your living room, and quietly started replacing you. You notice it in small moments first, or maybe not even moments, more like absences. Like something that should be there but isn't. Like he's sitting right across from you on the couch, but somehow not really there. Eyes locked onto a screen, headphones in, maybe even laughing at something you can't see, something you're not part of. And you realize you don't actually know what's happening in his head anymore. Not in real time. Not even close. And that's new. That's the part that feels different from how you grew up. Because silence used to mean something else. It used to be shared. Now it feels like you're sitting next to a ghost. And it's not just the phone anymore. That would almost be easier, right? It's the layers on top of it. The spatial audio that seals him off. The headset that wraps around his senses. The way the sound seems to come from inside his own skull instead of the room. And you can call his name once, twice, 3 times. And there's that slight delay before he even registers you exist. Like he has to come back from somewhere. Like he's been somewhere else entirely. And you're standing there wondering how you're supposed to compete with something that doesn't just entertain him, it absorbs him. Hey guys, before we continue, I just quickly want to let you know I do have a screen time reset guide available where I go over how your son can reduce his screen time by 80% in 21 days. Make sure to check it out. I put the link in the description for you. Let's get back to the video. Because that's what it is. It's not distraction. It's absorption. It's a full takeover of attention. Attention is where life actually happens. That's the uncomfortable part. If his attention is somewhere else, then so is he. And suddenly the living room feels heavier than it should. Not loud, not chaotic, just heavy. Like something important is missing, but you can't quite name it. And you start to realize that this kind of silence is worse than noise. Because at least noise meant engagement. And this is just absence. Then you start asking yourself, who's actually shaping him? Because it used to be obvious, didn't it? Parents, teachers, maybe older siblings, maybe a coach. There was a chain of influence, like a transfer of values, ways of thinking, stories about how the world works. And now you're not so sure anymore because there's something else in the room, something that's speaking to him far more often than you are, something that doesn't sleep, doesn't get tired, doesn't lose patience, something that studies him. Platforms like TikTok and YouTube aren't just showing him random content. They're learning him, shaping him, and deciding what he sees next based on what keeps him there longest. Over time, without anyone announcing it, without any clear moment you can point to, they start to take over the role that used to belong to you. Not in an obvious way, not by giving direct advice like a parent would, but by curating the entire environment your son is growing up in. And that's the part that stings when you really let it sink in. It's not that he's rejecting you. It's that he's being raised somewhere else, in a feed, in a loop, in a world where engagement is the only metric that matters. And you can feel this quiet resentment building, not necessarily toward him, but toward the fact that his worldview is being assembled by something that doesn't know him the way you do, that doesn't care about him the way you do, and yet somehow has more influence on him. Because where does your son go when he wants to feel understood? When he's confused, when he's curious, when he's bored? It's not automatically you anymore. It's whatever community the algorithm drops him into. And sometimes that community is fine. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's cynical, sometimes it's extreme, sometimes it's just shallow. But it feels like belonging. because it's always there, always responding, always feeding him something. Meanwhile, you're sitting a few meters away, feeling like a stranger in your own home. And then there's the way his body reacts when you try to pull him back. You know, that moment when you call him to dinner or ask him to put the phone down and you see it. That subtle irritation, that tension, like you've interrupted something important. And in his mind, you have. Because you're asking him to step out of a high stimulation environment into something slower, quieter, less immediately rewarding, and his nervous system doesn't like that transition. It's not just attitude, it's physiological. His brain has been sitting in a constant stream of novelty, reward, anticipation, and now suddenly he's expected to sit at a table and talk, to be present, and to engage in something that unfolds over minutes instead of milliseconds. Obviously, that feels like a downgrade, even if he can't articulate that, even if you can't either. You just feel the friction. And that friction adds up, not in dramatic explosions necessarily, but in small withdrawals, shorter answers, less eye contact, more yeah and I don't know, and over time, something else starts to disappear. Something you might not even notice at first, which is shared boredom, the kind of boredom that used to force conversation, that used to create space for jokes, for stories, for nothing in particular. Just the kind of space that was there to just be together. Now, there's no space for that because any gap gets filled instantly and any moment of potential connection gets replaced by a scroll, a video, a notification. Without those empty spaces, something essential doesn't get built. The ability to sit with another person without stimulation, to talk without a script, to feel comfortable in silence that's actually shared, not divided. And you start to see the longer term implications, not in some abstract societal way, but in very practical terms. Because how does he handle conflict if his main experience of disagreement is muting someone or blocking them from swiping away? How does he navigate tension in real life when the default response online is to disengage instantly? There's no practice there, no reps. So when something uncomfortable comes up at home, or later in relationships, or at work, what does your son do? Does he lean in? Or does he retreat? Does he try to resolve it? Or does he look for an exit? Because that's what he's been trained to do. Not by you, but by the environment he spends most of his time in. Then there's this strange contradiction that becomes harder and harder to ignore. Because technically, you're more connected than ever. Devices, messages, constant access, right? And yet emotionally, it feels like there's a growing distance, like you're living parallel lives under the same roof, intersecting occasionally, but not really sharing the same world. That's the invisible wall that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up as a clear problem you can point to. It just gradually builds layer by layer, feed by feed, until one day you realize you don't actually know what your son thinks about certain things, what he cares about, what he's worried about. That realization hits harder than any argument ever could. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this is that this fragmentation, this separation, doesn't happen by accident. It serves someone, it benefits something, because the more time he spends in those environments, the more valuable his attention becomes, the more data gets collected, the more precisely the next piece of content can be tailored, and the cycle continues. Companies like Instagram or Epic Games don't need him to be fulfilled. They need him to be engaged, and that difference is where everything you're feeling starts to make sense. Because what's good for their platform is not necessarily what's good for your home. So you end up in this position where you're trying to reach him, talk to him, guide him, while competing with something that has more time with him, more data on him, more iterations of what works and what doesn't. And it's not a fair fight, not even close. And maybe that's the first honest realization that needs to land. that what's happening in your living room is not just about parenting, it's about influence. And right now, whether anyone wants to admit it or not, you're sharing that role with something that was never meant to raise a human being.